Dad, I just thought you'd understand. That's what my son said when I found out I hadn't been invited to his wedding. Not from him. Not from a phone call. Not from a card in the mail. I found out because my neighbor Paulette mentioned it while we were both grabbing our bins off the curb on a Tuesday morning. She'd seen photos on Facebook. My son and his wife, smiling in a vineyard somewhere in the Niagara region, her in a dress, him in a suit I'd never seen before. Paulette looked at me the way people look at you when they've just realized they've said something they shouldn't have. I told her congratulations and went back inside. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that. The coffee went cold. I didn't notice. My name is Dennis Holt. I'm 67 years old. I live in a small house in Barrie, Ontario, the same house I've owned for 31 years. I worked for 34 years as a pipe fitter for a mechanical contractor out of Aurelia. Not glamorous work, the kind of work that finds you on your knees in a crawl space at 6 in the morning in January, or up on scaffolding in August heat that makes you feel like you're working inside a toaster. The kind of work where you show up whether you feel like it or not, because other people are counting on you, and the bills don't care how your back feels. My wife, Judith, passed away 12 years ago. Ovarian cancer. We found out in March. She was gone by October. We had 7 months between the diagnosis and the end, and I spent most of them trying to hold two things together at once. Her hand in my son's world. He was 22 at the time. Just finished his first year of a business degree at Ryerson. I told him to stay in school. She told him the same thing. So he did, and I drove down to Toronto every weekend that summer to make sure he was eating and sleeping and not falling apart completely. His name is Joel. He's 34 now. He works in finance in Toronto, makes decent money, lives in a condo in Liberty Village with his wife Cassie. I met Cassie 3 times before the wedding apparently happened. That detail still stops me sometimes. 3 times. After Judith died, I kept working. I didn't know what else to do with the silence. I picked up overtime whenever I could, partly because I needed the distraction, partly because Joel still needed help, and I wanted to make sure he had one less thing to worry about. A textbook here, a car repair there. When he graduated and moved to Toronto, I helped him with his first and last month's rent on an apartment near Spadina. When the apartment didn't work out and he moved somewhere better, I helped again. When he and Cassie decided they wanted a nicer place before they got serious about starting a family, I transferred money to cover the difference in their rent for almost 3 years. I never made conditions. I never asked for anything in return. That's what you do when you're a parent. At least, that's what I believed. I called Joel the night after Paulette told me. He picked up on the second ring. "Hey, Dad." He sounded exactly like himself, casual, unbothered, which told me everything before I even said a word. "I saw your wedding photos," I said. A pause, short, but there. "Oh." Not surprise, not panic, just that one word, sitting there like an admission. "When were you planning to tell me, Joel?" Another pause, longer this time. We wanted to keep it small. I looked out my kitchen window. The backyard was the same as it had always been. The same maple Judith and I planted the year we moved in, big enough now that it shades the whole back half of the lawn in summer. "Small," I repeated. "Yeah, I counted 46 people in the photos." "Nothing. Your cousin Derek was there." Silence. "Your Aunt Lorraine was there." More silence. 3 of Cassie's friends from university were there, women I've never even met, and they were there. A longer silence. But I wasn't. He finally spoke. "Cassie and I wanted the guest list to reflect people who are currently part of our daily lives. Dad, you're in Barrie. We see you a few times a year." I let that sit for a moment. I wanted to be sure I'd heard it right. A few times a year. I thought about 34 years of being on a job site before the sun came up. I thought about every check I'd ever written with his name on the memo line. I thought about October, 12 years ago, when I drove home from the hospital and sat in this kitchen alone for the first time in my adult life and cried until I couldn't anymore, and then got up the next morning and called his residence at Ryerson to make sure he was okay before I called anyone else. "I see," I said. "Don't make this bigger than it needs to be." I didn't say anything after that. I just thanked him for picking up and ended the call. I sat there for a while. The house was quiet. It's almost always quiet now, which is something nobody really prepares you for when you're young. People talk about retirement as though it's one long Saturday morning. They don't mention that there's a version of it that feels less like freedom and more like being slowly made irrelevant. My old friend Jerry called me the next day. He's retired RCMP, 69 years old, one of those people who says exactly what he means and never apologizes for it. I've known him since we were in our 30s. "You doing all right?" he asked. "No," I said. "Good. What happened?" I told him everything. When I finished, he was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said something I've been thinking about ever since. "Dennis, you've been bidding on a contract you already won." "What?" "You're his father. You don't have to keep proving that." It wasn't complicated advice, but sometimes the simple things are the hardest to see when you're standing in the middle of them. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened my laptop and started looking at travel. Not anything extravagant. I'm not that kind of person. But I'd always wanted to see the Maritimes properly, not just drive through on the way somewhere else. A slow trip, the coastal highway through Cape Breton, Prince Edward Island in late summer. The kind of trip I kept saying I'd take someday, and someday kept not arriving because there was always something more pressing. I booked it the next morning. 2 weeks. Driving my own car. No itinerary beyond a general direction. 3 days later, while my son and his wife were presumably settling back into their condo in Liberty Village with their wedding gifts, and their registry items, and their life that apparently fit just fine without me in it, I loaded my car and drove east. I want to tell you, I felt sad the whole time. That would make a more sympathetic story, probably. But the truth is, by the time I crossed into New Brunswick, something shifted, not healed, just loosened, like a knot you've had in your shoulder so long you'd stopped noticing it. And then one day you turn your head a certain way and feel it release slightly, and you realize how long it had been there. I spent a week on Cape Breton Island. I hiked the Cabot Trail in pieces, a few kilometers at a time, because my knees aren't what they were. I ate chowder in small restaurants where the staff knew everyone who walked in. I talked to people, older people, mostly, retired fishermen, former miners, a woman who'd run a bed and breakfast for 30 years and was finally thinking about selling. People with lines in their faces and stories they told without performance. One afternoon, I sat on a bench outside a small museum in Cheticamp and got talking with a man named Pete who must have been close to 80. He'd fished the Gulf of St. Lawrence his whole working life. He walked with a cane and had hands that looked like mine, the permanent kind of rough you get from decades of physical work. He asked why I was traveling alone. I told him a version of the truth. My son got married recently. I wasn't invited. He looked out at the water for a while. Then he said, "You know what the ocean teaches you?" I said I didn't. People show you what you mean to them. The mistake is when you keep arguing with what they've shown you. It wasn't anger or bitterness when he said it. Just something he'd arrived at through a long time of living. I didn't say much back. I didn't need to. The rest of the drive east felt different. Not light, exactly, but clearer. I had a lot of time to think, and what I kept coming back to was a question I'd been avoiding for years. At what point does helping become something else? Not for the person you're helping, but for you? Because I'd told myself for 3 years that the money I was sending Joel and Cassie every month was temporary. They were getting started. Toronto is expensive. I understood that. Anyone who's lived in this country in the last decade understands that. But temporary is a word that means something specific. It means it ends. And the transfers hadn't ended. They'd just become part of the arrangement. An unspoken line item in a budget I'd never been shown. I stopped at a grocery store in Moncton and bought enough food for a couple of days. While I was loading the car, I looked at my phone. Nothing from Joel, nothing from Cassie. No message asking how I was or where I'd gone. I thought about that for a moment, then put the phone away and drove to find my campsite. I didn't expect what happened when I landed back in Barrie 2 weeks later. I'd barely turned airplane mode off. I'd switched to flying for the last leg when my phone started filling up. Texts, missed calls, voicemails. For a second, my heart jumped, the way it does when you're a parent and you see a flood of messages from your kid. You always think the worst first. Then I read the first text. Dad, have you transferred the money this month? Then another. The rent came out and it wasn't there. Then from Cassie. Dennis, is everything okay? Joel's been trying to reach you. Then from Joel, later that same night. Dad, we need to talk. The landlord sent a notice. And then the next morning. This isn't fair. You knew we were counting on this. I sat in the arrivals area of the Barrie airport with my bag between my feet, reading through all of it. Not in a hurry, just reading. The way you read something when you want to understand what it actually says rather than what you expected it to say. You knew we were counting on this. Not, I hope you're okay. Not, sorry I wasn't in touch while you were away. Just, you knew we were counting on this. I drove home. I didn't call anyone back that night. I made dinner, watched some television, and the next morning I sat down with my old paper bank statements, the ones I'd kept in a box in the office, because I don't fully trust digital records. 34 months of regular transfers. Sometimes 1,200, sometimes 15, depending on the month. I got out a notepad and a calculator and added it up the way I'd learned to do things, slowly and without shortcuts. The total was more than I'd let myself think about. I could have put a significant down payment on a property with that money. Instead, it had gone into someone else's rent, someone else's lifestyle, someone else's assumption that the gap between what they wanted and what they could afford would always be covered. The phone rang. Joel, I answered. Finally, he said. Not hello. Not I was worried. Just, finally. Morning, I said. Dad, what is going on? The money wasn't there. I kept my voice level. I know. The landlord sent us a late notice. I heard. Then why didn't you transfer it? That question, the way it sat in the sentence. Not could you, or would you be able to? Just why didn't you? As though I'd forgotten to do something on a to-do list. As though the question of whether I was going to do it had already been settled without anyone asking me. I looked around my kitchen. The same kitchen I'd been in the day. Judith told me her diagnosis. The same kitchen where I'd sat with a 1-month-old Joel in the middle of the night while she slept. Convinced I was doing everything wrong and too terrified to ask anyone because I didn't want to look like I didn't know what I was doing. The same kitchen where I'd eaten alone for 12 years. Joel, I said, when did this become my bill to pay? Silence. I'm asking an honest question. You've always helped. And there it was. Not thank you. Not I appreciate it. Just, you've always helped. As though that was a contract. As though doing something for years meant you'd agreed to do it forever. It was supposed to be temporary, I said. He sighed. That particular sigh. The one that says you're being unreasonable without saying it. Dad, this isn't the time. I think it might be. I could hear Cassie in the background. Muffled. I couldn't make out the words. Joel lowered his voice. Can we just handle the rent first and talk about the rest later? That sentence told me more than any of the texts had. The rent was the priority. The conversation could wait. I was the means to a practical end, not someone whose feelings were part of the calculation. I'd spent 34 years being someone people could rely on. Punctual, dependable, the kind of man who shows up before he's asked and stays later than he needs to. I was proud of that. I still am. But somewhere along the way, I'd confused being reliable with being obligated. And those aren't the same thing. I opened the text conversation on my phone. Typed one sentence. Read it back twice. I told you from the beginning that help is something you offer, not something you owe. The response came in under a minute. Are you serious right now? Then, this is about the wedding, isn't it? Then, I can't believe this. I set the phone face down on the kitchen table. And for the first time in what felt like a very long time, I didn't move to fix anything. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. Not peaceful, not right away, but quiet. The kind of quiet that you either learn to sit with or you fill with noise to avoid it. I'd been filling it with noise for a long time. The noise of being needed. The noise of being useful. Those things feel like purpose when you're inside them. From the outside, sometimes they're just avoidance. I joined a hiking group out of Barrie. Wednesday mornings. Nothing brutal. Just trails around Kempenfelt Bay and up into the hills north of town. A dozen or so people, mostly around my age, a few a bit younger. Former teachers, a retired nurse, a guy who'd owned a plumbing company for 20 years. People who'd built things and raised families and were now figuring out who they were outside of that. I started sleeping better. I started reading again. Something I'd let go somewhere in my 50s when the days got too full. Joel called once, about 3 weeks in. His tone had changed. Less demanding. More careful. "I think we need to talk," he said. "Okay," I said. He came up to Barry that Saturday. Drove himself, no Cassie. That surprised me a little. He'd always been better at hard conversations with a buffer nearby. He looked tired when he got here. Not physically, but in the way that people look tired when they've been carrying something they didn't know, was heavy until they tried to set it down. I made coffee. We sat at the same kitchen table we'd always sat at. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "How much have you sent us over the last 3 years?" I told him. He looked at his coffee cup. "I didn't know it was that much," he said. "I know," I said, "because I never told you, and you never asked." He looked up at that. "Not to be harsh," I said, "just honest. Neither of us ever sat down and looked at what was actually happening." He was quiet again. Then, "Why didn't you say something?" It was a fair question. "Because I didn't want you to think I couldn't manage, or that I was keeping score. I just wanted to help." I paused. But at some point, it stopped feeling like help and started feeling like a subscription you'd both forgotten you were signed up for. He didn't push back on that, which told me he'd already been thinking something similar. What came out over the next hour surprised me. Not all at once, and not without some defensiveness that we had to move through first. But piece by piece. Cassie had been against asking me for help from the beginning, he said. She'd wanted them to find a less expensive place when they moved. Joel had been the one who pushed for the neighborhood they were in, the lifestyle they were living, the gap my transfers had been quietly filling. He hadn't hidden it from her exactly, but he hadn't been fully honest about how dependent they were on it either. I'd thought this was a story about my son and his wife making choices together. It turned out it was a story about my son and his wife not quite talking to each other about what those choices cost. "She's angry," he said. "At me?" "At me," he said, "for not handling things the way she thought we should." I didn't say anything to that. It wasn't my situation to fix. What I did say was this: "I'm not trying to punish you. I need you to hear that. I'm not withholding money because of the wedding. I'm stopping because I should have stopped a long time ago. What I was doing wasn't helping you build anything. It was helping you maintain something that didn't belong to both of you equally." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, quietly, "I know." We sat there for a while after that. Not in silence exactly. We talked about smaller things. The drive up, his work, the hiking group I'd joined, his mother's maple tree in the backyard that had finally grown into itself after all these years. Normal things. But underneath the normal things, something had shifted. The way a room feels different after you've opened a window you didn't realize had been sealed. He left in the late afternoon. At the door he paused. "Dad," he said, "I'm sorry you weren't there." It was the first time he'd said it, not explained it, not justified it, just said it. "I know," I said. "I should have handled it differently." I nodded. "I'm going to need some time to figure things out," he said. "The finances. Everything." "That's okay," I said. "Take the time." He drove back to Toronto. I went and stood in the backyard for a while as the sun went down. In the months that followed, things didn't transform the way they do in movies. Life doesn't work on that kind of schedule. What happened was slower, and in some ways more real for being slow. Joel and Cassie worked through whatever they needed to work through between themselves. There was a period of a few weeks where things were clearly strained. I could hear it in his voice when he called, though he never went into detail. I didn't ask. I'd learned at this point in my life that other people's marriages aren't problems you can solve from the outside. He found a smaller place, not a downgrade in his words, a recalibration. Somewhere he could actually afford on what they earned together, without the buffer. He was matter-of-fact about it when he told me, which made me more proud of him than he probably realized. Cassie called me once, on her own, without Joel. That surprised me enough that I almost didn't recognize her number. "I wanted to apologize," she said, "for the wedding. That was my call as much as his, and I've been thinking about it for a long time. I listened. I told myself it was just logistics, she said. It wasn't. It was selfish, and I felt bad about it. I appreciate you saying that, I said. We should have done things differently. Yes, I said. But what matters more is what comes after. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Joel's different lately, I think in a good way. More honest with himself. I think so too, I said. We talked for another few minutes. Nothing dramatic. Just two people who'd been cautious around each other for a long time finally having a real conversation. One afternoon in the spring, I got a card in the mail, handwritten, in Joel's handwriting, which I hadn't seen on paper since he was in university. It was 2 pages. I read it at the kitchen's table with my coffee, and I read it again after. He talked about his mother, about how, when she died, he'd watched me hold everything together without ever once suggesting that he should carry any of it. He'd been 22. He'd taken the stability I provided and never fully questioned where it came from or what it cost. He wrote, I think I kept expecting you to be a resource instead of a person. I don't fully know when that started, but I know it was wrong and I'm sorry. That line. I've read it more times than I can count. He ended by saying he wanted to plan something for the summer. Not anything big, just a few days. Maybe drive up to Algonquin, do some canoe camping the way we used to when he was a teenager. Before everything got complicated. Back when things between us were simple enough that we could just be in a boat together and not need to solve anything. I wrote back, told him I'd like that. The trip happened in August. 4 days, 2 canoes. He brought a friend. I was fine on my own. I've been paddling since before he was born. We camped on a portage route we'd done once when he was 15. He'd complained the whole time back then. This time he didn't complain once. On the 3rd evening we made a fire and sat with it for a while after dinner. The kind of quiet that only happens when you're far enough from everything that the world can't reach you. Loons calling somewhere across the water. That particular darkness you only get in true wilderness, where the stars look like they're actually close to you rather than impossibly far. He said, out of nowhere, I think I forgot how much you've always just shown up. I poked at the fire with a stick. I mean that literally, he said. You just show up. You don't make noise about it. I thought about that for a moment. Your mother used to say that was my best quality and my worst one, I said. Best because people could rely on me. Worst because I let people assume I didn't have needs of my own. He was quiet. She was probably right, I said. He looked at the fire. I want to be better at that, at noticing. You're doing it now, I said. We didn't say much after that. We didn't need to. The fire burned down and we went to our tents. In the morning he was up before me, which hadn't happened in a long time, and he had water on the camp stove already. Small things. The kind people don't think to mention in the bigger story of their lives. But the small things are what the bigger story is actually made of. I'm not writing this because I figured everything out. I haven't. I'm 67. My knees bother me more than they used to. I forget names faster than I'd like. And there are mornings when the house is so quiet that I have to turn on the radio just to hear another voice. That's still the life I'm living. But something else is true now, too. My son and I talk on the phone most Sundays. Not long calls, half an hour maybe, sometimes less. But real conversations. He asks how I am and means it. I ask about his week and he tells me the actual answer, not the everything's fine version. He called last month to say they're looking at a house, something they can actually carry on their own. He sounded nervous about it and proud at the same time, the way people sound when they're doing something hard that matters. I told him that was good. I meant it. And Cassie, she sent me a photo on my birthday, just her and Joel on a trail somewhere. She'd written on the back, thinking of you. Hope it's a good one. 3 years ago, I didn't know her well enough to recognize her handwriting. Now I do. I think about Judith sometimes, in moments like that. I think she would have liked to see this, not the difficult parts that led here, but the result of them. The version of her son who is learning, slowly and imperfectly, what it means to be honest with the people who love him. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that love and obligation aren't the same thing. I used to confuse them. I thought being a good father meant making myself indispensable. That if I was useful enough, needed enough, available enough, the relationship would take care of itself. It doesn't work that way. Relationships take care of themselves when people are honest with each other, when they're willing to have the conversation that's easier to avoid, when they respect each other enough to tell the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable. I spent years trying to earn my son's appreciation by making his life easier. What actually brought us closer was the year I stopped. Not because I stopped caring, because caring, real caring, sometimes means letting people figure out what things cost. If you've spent years quietly carrying something for someone who doesn't realize you're carrying it, I understand that. And if you've been waiting for them to notice, I understand that too. Sometimes they don't notice until the weight lands on them. And sometimes that's the most loving thing you can allow to happen. Don't wait as long as I did to ask yourself what you need. You've earned that question.